Hello and welcome to the Atelier Forum podcast. My name is Stephen Bauman and I'm sitting across from Cornelia Hernes.
Hi everyone.
And today we're doing an FAQ podcast, so a frequently asked questions podcast. This format is mostly to kind of talk about things that we get asked in workshops, so students who are kind of just starting out oil painting or starting out drawing and painting, or even advanced students for that matter. But there's this sort of consistent group of questions that you can count on, and we're going to be kind of breaking down and kind of walking out on all of those sort of topics. The one we're tackling today is actually the flesh tones question, right? So a little bit of everything about flesh tones in oil painting. By that we mean color values. I think you'd have to start to speak about it like that.
Yes. And then we can maybe define also what that means exactly, color values, because of course that's just two words that are jumbled together, but that is so because that's kind of reflects the thinking process as when are mixing color and values combined.
Because you start out like just saying color, right? Like, how do I mix flesh colors? That's in a way that's the frequently asked question. But then the immediate response from the instructor is always going to be like,
values.
Well, color
first.
values, really, right? Because if it's the wrong value, like the color is never going to be on.
Yeah. I think if we were to break it down into a sort of pyramid of priority, in the context of representational artwork, then structure comes first. So gesture, proportion, shadow shape, light shape. And then value becomes a part of that because the relative equation at which something is darker or lighter specifically corresponds to the way in which planes turn towards or against the light source, and therefore values are created. So anything that is three-dimensional contains values, and so those values can speak of structure if you let it. So in that kind of pyramid of priority, structure as pertains to spatial relationships between shapes and proportions, but also values. Then I would argue for color.
Yeah, it's like the thing is like color is always supposed to like sit on top of these things. There's like a Maslow's pyramid of like the needs of a painting, right? Like color would be at the top of the pyramid. Like if your design is good.
According to some thoughts,
Yeah, well, sure. Like, there's going to be competing theories, right? But like wherever we've studied and we've taught, it's always that you would have your design would be good. So like the proportions and things, your values would be good, and then colors colors the thing that everything else has to kind of prepare for in order for it to work, right? Because the thing about that frequently asked question about flesh tones is, students will ask, oh, whenever I try to like paint the cool colors in flesh, it always looks muddy and things. Specifically that question is where they're talking about value, not color. Because if you paint those cool tones in the right value, so like you have these kind of planes being represented, you have a light plane, and someone puts like a dark purple in the middle of it, it always looks muddy, right? Well, if that dark purple was actually a light purple, if it was like an appropriate value for that plane, it would actually harmonize much better with what was around it.
Certainly. Then that's a part of the equation. So with that sort of theory of thought, it's based on this idea that if your structure, gesture and proportion, shadow shape, light shape, is not exactly right, then it doesn't matter so much what the values are doing. And also the same is true if your values are a bit off. It doesn't matter so much what your colors are doing because the equation is falling apart. Whereas if your colors is not exactly correct, but a little bit, topsy-turvy, if you have a really good gesture, proportion, structure, and value, the painting can still carry. And in fact, you have done a lot of work where you have deliberately changed the color essence of something, as an artistic statement to great results.
It's interesting to think too that like technically speaking, that color has a value, but value does not have a color, right? So like to make a grayscale, to make a grayscale, you'd be using black and white, which are non-colors.
Okay,
Right, so you're making a grayscale, 1 to 10, lightest to darkest, out of black and white, gray, a non-color. So you could say in a sense that necessarily, right, color has to sit on top of value in that theoretical Maslow's pyramid of needs, right?
You think color is before value?
No, it's after.
Yes,
It's
but
after.
you're pointing.
I'm sorry, the pyramid was like this,
Okay.
but then the value scale might have been in a different configuration. Point being, though, that I think it would be technically accurate to say that actually it has to go that way. Because if you get, all right, so say you're mixing up a flesh color, right? Mm-hmm. You mix it up at the wrong value, it actually can't be the right color, technically. You would have to add or subtract something from it.
Yeah. Whereas if you have the correct value and then the temperature is a little bit hither or thither, it can still carry. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Temperature is the next point, too.
Yeah.
You want to take it?
No. This is I think a little bit funny too, because I love color and I love color harmonies and I love talking about color, but it's also something that I feel very insecure about sometimes.
Really?
I think it's because I care so deeply about it that and also because I recognize that it is very relative. That while we can talk about values and structure in a very, maybe a little bit more objective sense, I think color is so relative, and that's kind of where I find it's very fascinating, but it's also is where I run into second guessing myself. But like even with black and white combined, that creates a grayscale that is the non-color. That's true, but it's also true that you put that very same combination on a limited palette or even a grisaille, you have a blue, in harmony with a earth red and a earth yellow. And I think that's kind of so fascinating about color and why it is so complicated, because it is so relative.
And relativity actually may be the perfect segue into the whole warm, cool conversation, right?
Yeah.
Because the other problem that you have a lot of times, just about every workshop ever, right? Every figure painting workshop ever, portrait painting, is you wind up with a painting where students kind of just getting into oil painting and they're just sort of looking at the tip of the iceberg of color, and you wind up with a figure that is either uniformly warm or uniformly cool, right? Which actually looks nothing like a skin tone. The thing that you understand always is that, like, in order for flesh to look kind of fleshy, it has to have both warm, or in this case, like, warm is like kind of an analog for orange, right? If you look at a color wheel, you have orange on one side, blue on the other. These are complementary colors. Blue we choose as the catch-all for cold, and orange the catch-all for warm, right? So when you think about orange or peachy kind of tints in skin tones, if it was only that, you'd look like a Barbie doll, right? Or a Ken doll.
Yeah.
So you need that kind of sense of like cold or kind of blue temperatures, essentially. Or some relatively cooler temperature to like make it seem fleshy. But relativity being the key in it, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because it doesn't mean, I often talk about a color being green in the context of portrait in the figure. I'm sure you do the same. But that's really just all within a very small spectrum of variation. But basically this means that in relationship to something being a bit more red or more pink, something is appearing more purple or more green. But it's all, when we talk about portraiture and the figure, we're talking about all kinds of grays, essentially. Colorful grays with variation of values.
Neutralized colors.
Neutralized colors, And neutralized colors means that you have the three primary colors, which is blue, yellow, and red, that are counterbalancing each other and kind of canceling each other out, and thus neutralizing each other.
Well, I think you need secondary colors to get to complementary, right? Because if you have just the primaries, then you have like yellow, blue, red, and neither one of them like sits directly across from the other on the color.
No, but if you have like a combination of all those three colors combined, then you basically have complementary and a secondary in all like 360 degrees of the color wheel.
Exactly. So it's so it is a matter, like a lot of times with flesh tones, the other difficulty after kind of finding color diversity or a spectrum of warm and cool is to find the right level of saturation, right? That's the other, like, just every time somebody starts oil painting, it's either way too saturated or way too like undersaturated, right? Because like mixing oil colors is so kind of particular. Each pigment will have a different personality, right? So somebody will have like a really strong red on their palette and a really weak yellow.
Yeah.
And like everything on their figure turns to this like
really red.
like like bloody red, or like it mixes with black and you get this ruddy kind of purple to it, because the yellow is like out of balance and they're not sure of like what proportions to fit into the admixture.
Yeah.
And like over time you learn to kind of balance your palette a little bit, or to alternatively like just figure out how much of each one to kind of take.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation as well, just the selection of the colors to choose on the palette, precisely with that kind of balancing process. Because it is possible to have a very dominant color, like let's say an Old Holland English red.
Yeah. Super strong.
That I kind of refer to as a bit of the narcissist on the palette, like it wants to take over every conversation. But when you treat it with care, it can be such a beautiful color to have. But it's too complex, I think, in many ways to have that. And let's say an Old Holland genuine ochre, which, from what I recall, is kind of pasty and kind of gritty, doesn't have a lot of chromatic impact. So even when it's just mixed or tinted with white, it kind of gets a little bit pasty. And so you have that together with a very colorful red, and it's a bit off balance in terms of the yellow and red ratio. Meanwhile, if you have a blue-ridge yellow ochre by natural pigment, for example, that has a strong enough personality to be able to temper the English red by Old Holland. But there are tons of earth reds out there that have a similar color appearance when you push it out of the tube, but then when you tint it with white or you mix it with other colors, it's a little bit more easygoing.
Yeah, so there's this, so it creates this problem of like saturation, right? Like how do you kind of neutralize colors? And really the answer to that, of course, goes back to the warm-cool question, right? So let's say your palette is, what I use is just like black, red, yellow, and white. Like that's kind of what I use for most of my paintings nowadays. No, I mean I use a very limited palette. I mean, and Alizarin Crimson.
But you do use colorful colors, so they actually have a full range.
They do have a full range, but just to say, like, if you had that palette, the neutralization would look like this, right? So I want to make like say kind of a peachy flesh tone. I'm going to take some of my vermilion. Some of my yellow-brown, I'm going to mix those together, and I'm going to have an orange that's like way oversaturated. It would never like fit in place like on a
flesh
body,
tint spectrum.
Right? Like it would look like a tangerine or something, right?
Yeah.
So how do I get that to like fit into the flesh tone spectrum? Well, I have to neutralize. Now, orange is the complement of blue, but I don't have blue in my palette. I have black. What you mentioned earlier, right? How in the right context, in relationship to a really strong orange, a black kind of acts like a blue. It's a cooler color, cooler temperature to that. So I'd mix a bit of black and a bit of white into my orange. It would neutralize it down to a place that might fit like on a flesh tone palette.
Yeah.
Right? So that's how the process is going to work. Like every time you're kind of choosing a color to apply to the figure, it's a matter of finding just the right amount of saturation, just the right value. By the way, I'm just describing why it's really hard. But something I think like you're incredible at is actually, I think the hardest discipline in this is learning to do it with your palette knife.
Because you're a brush mixer?
That's a lot
harder.
But no, I switched. Well, I mean, it is, it's like it's harder to like perform that. It requires more experience, but I think it's harder to learn actually if you're just a brush mixer. And I think palette knife mixing and like mixing up pre-mixtures is actually, spending years doing that was how I kind of came to grips with color
brush
and value
mixing.
in the figure.
Yeah, for sure. It is also like bicycling in terms of just, I remember very clearly just entering into understanding color and value and even the concept of that. And then to just exercise that repetition And I took a color class with Carlos Madrid. And at that time, I didn't really comprehend the full theory behind it.
So many color mixtures.
It was like a mandala of color.
It was enormous.
Yeah, it was.
And it was made of these
hundreds of little
tiny,
colors.
tiny swatches of color.
It's very beautiful in the end. It looked
Yeah.
like a kaleidoscope of color.
Yeah.
But just the value for me, not even fully comprehending the fantastic theory behind it, was just a practice of repeat the color that you see on this patch right here. And it's going to consist of a cadmium orange and a white and maybe a brown or something like that, and then repeat it. And so that's something I recommend, just for the color. Like if you find that color is a mystery, I think it's really valuable. I find it's really valuable just to set aside some color chips and just repeat the color mixing for that, and not necessarily applying it to the context of the figure or portrait, because then you have the added pressure of thinking about the drawing and the structure, which obviously is important to exercise as well. But to just meditate on color mixing is incredibly valuable.
Color matching also is what you're describing, of course, right? It's like, I remember, because we would work on these like really, really long projects in school. We'd have like 75 hours with the model over 5 weeks. And so you'd go in, you'd make your flesh tone mixtures, like the first couple of days or whatever. And then I remember, like at a certain period in my training, it was actually really challenging to actually just match that color.
The next day?
Yeah, because I'd run out of it, or like it would, it'd form a skin over the top, so you're all nasty, and
you have to throw it out.
you have to throw it out.
Yeah.
But you want to remix, and since you're painting the same painting, you want to have like the same color value.
Yeah.
That process of like trying to match, to start out with these like raw pigments and come to this like really specific point in the color space. Right, was like
which is very two-dimensional.
It was so hard.
Yeah.
At a certain now, I mean, I don't even kind of think about it now, but developing that sense of like accuracy about how to get from A to B on your palette is super important.
I remember even a time before we were students, where this was even. It's so far back in time.
100 years ago.
So I had no concept of what a palette knife was.
Yeah.
Barely a palette. And all the blending I did was just fan brush. And so if there was like even a little patch within the figure that was off and I needed to repaint it, I just remember going, now I have to repaint the whole thing, because everything was just blending. Whereas now, I know how to reactivate a particular area with oiling out. So I can see the color and the value that's actually there, and then mixing specific color for that particular zone, and then repaint that particular area, and not have to like repaint everything. Yeah. And that was such a milestone moment to discover, because it was sure complicated to, the time before then, being
that
completely...
fixing one spot thing, that was like a personal
nightmare.
Student hell, like to be in. Because you'd go like, there's no way nowadays. You'd mix the right color, the right value for the right plane, and just dive it in.
It's a little bit like a surgery sometimes. I feel like you just. As surgery, like they have like the sheet and then they have like a little incision in like the space that they're operating on. And it's a little bit like that. You just activate that particular zone in a painting and there you go. But I will say though that if I continue a painting from one day to the next day and I intend to repaint everything anyway, then I'm not so pedantic over the absolute precision over the palette from one day to the next. I will actually change it sometimes quite a bit, where I find that, I came really far to the color and the value and the resolution on this layer, but now I can push some temperature aspects further or value aspects further. Or today I want to work in the area of the mouth a little bit more, for example, and I will mix more color values for the particular task at hand.
Yeah, I think like in the longest term is that pendulum swing, right? It's like when I first started out, working on flesh tones and working in the model room, it was totally out of control, right? Just
Yes.
no idea how to do
Bambi on
anything.
ice.
Completely Bambi on ice. And then, as you figure out, well, you want to gain more control, so you start like kind of pushing all of your momentum in that direction, and then you go way over the line, and you control everything so much that it's like that sort of thrill of the sort of found color gets lost in the control. I know that, this exact thing happened for me. I was mixing out like a color matrix of like 18 different halftone flesh colors, in 3 different threads and 6 different columns. It was down to a very scientific process for me, and I just got lost in the control of it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I needed to kind of break away, to kind of swing back, get that pendulum to kind of swing back in the other direction.
Yeah.
To just have like a little bit of, variety, a little bit of chaos to kind of flavor the control, I guess.
Yes, exactly. And this is another thing too, like I don't think it's certainly not so scientific in the sense that in order to obtain a specific color and value, you need the proportion of A, B, and C. Like theoretically, it's even possible to have slightly different colors and obtain a similar, or not, if not identical, color and value.
Yeah.
And that's very liberating as well. So once one
Yeah.
discover that while color and value is something very specific, it's also very forgiving, which is also where it comes in very handy to maybe mix a range of color values, but also tweak a bit, as you see fit during the painting process. To my mind comes the association of an instrument, that the palette is a finely tuned instrument to the project at hand. And now you get to play it. And that means not being very, I don't know.
Like that cat typing on a keyboard meme.
Working very hard.
Yeah.
Or very rigid, but to be fluid. Like you have laid out an organization now you can be fluid within it.
Improvise.
And
Yeah.
a little bit. Yeah, yes. Not ad hoc. Improvise based on putting down a color value on your painting. Does it work? Does it not? Does it need to be cooler, warmer, more orange, more purple, darker, lighter? That's actually the sum of the process, the thought process that one will then evaluate and then make the adjustment to. And then with repetition, that becomes very internalized and very intuitive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's like the musician, right? If music was simply meant to be what it was on the music sheet, right? There'd be no reason to ever go to a performance, right? Because why? It's just going to sound like every other version of that song that you've heard. But it's like the bits of flair, excitement in one area or something else. That's the improvisation. Like it's within a box for sure.
Yeah.
And that's all the color mixing and using your palette knife and going through these kind of procedures, these projects to kind of figure out how color works.
Yes.
So that you have in a way, you've gained the right to improvise, or the ability to maybe improvise well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's like jazz.
It's like jazz.
Yeah, get it like
jazz.
It is.
Yeah.
And also, color is a bit like music. So going back to this equation of having an Old Holland genuine ochre versus a English red is a little bit like the ochre would be like the triangle, in that equation, and the
like the triangle player,
ding, like in the background, and the Old Holland English red would be.
It would be like
a trumpet.
like those giant drums that they play at the back when.
Yes.
When there's like a bad person coming into the scene in an opera, just dum, dum.
For sure.
That would be.
Yeah.
With a tuba.
The tuba for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have.
It's the triangle.
Yeah. So it's nice to have a instrument that sort of balance each other, so that they can weave together and kind of orchestrate a beautiful translation of the color value harmonies in life.
Yeah. So do you think we wrap it up, or do you want to do? I mean, there's more on there.
Yeah.
We didn't even get to visual isolation.
I think we should get there.
So let's go to visual isolation. So one of your sort of favorite techniques in terms of just identifying color. Do you do this? I know that you do this when you're working from life.
Yeah.
I wonder if you do it when you're working from a photograph as well. But visual isolation, if you just want to take us through it, like what it is and why it is.
Yes.
I guess.
Wish I had examples here. I don't think I threw them out.
We can pull something up on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so visual isolation, it's a tool of observation that I found enormously helpful when I, as a student, learned color and value and to see color and value well. And it is a tool that I really push on a lot of students. And those who use it, really do see the value of it. So
the color value of it.
The color value of it. So the paradox of translating the color and the values of nature is that the very same translation that you are seeking can throw you off. Because it is so that if you have a color in a particular color context, so a color with a variation of colors around, the way that you see that color is going to be altered. So they do this observation test, for example, where you swear something is light pink in one context, and then in another context it looks like teal, completely opposite, just relative to how we read color.
Yeah, so like if you had like a warm temperature inside of a red hot context, right?
Yeah, it's
like
gonna
it would
cool.
look like it was gray.
Yeah.
But then if you have that same warm color in like a completely freezing cold context, it would look like it was the warmest temperature there.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
So
that
this is like, color context is huge, by the way.
It's
like,
massive.
It's just about everything.
Yeah. And that also ties down or connects to the choice of palette. I do think that having a palette is a little bit like a car. You get used to how it operates.
Yeah.
But if you have a white palette, I think probably that's the most useless color or non-color for a palette, because everything is going to look so dark on the white palette. It has taken
like the actual
me
surface of the value of the palette itself.
Exactly. And it took me some time to understand the value of having a gray palette, because I thought that everything kind of looks very cold on it, because that kind of gray palette is a little bit like this couch. It's fairly cool, whereas this is also kind of gray right here.
It's by the way, perfect, like cool, warm.
Yeah.
Really. These would be great.
I probably would choose this palette to work on, but I know people use that palette, kind of gray, and that works fine too. It definitely is something you get used to. But if you have a very cold surface that you're mixing your colors on, everything is going to look very warm. Or if you have a red palette, everything is going to look very cold, exactly what you're saying there. And the same is true for when we observe nature. That nature is so complex, it can be quite difficult to decipher what actually are the colors or the values that go into something. So the visual isolation device, what that is basically
show us what
creating
it looks like when you
two
do
circles.
Do that.
Yes, not like this, but like that.
Yeah.
So what I would advise is just to cut out like 2 CD cover size, just cardboard.
That reference might be
obscure. Back in the day when we had CDs.
So something a square of cardboard about this big, right? Where you can cut like a little hole about a centimeter by a centimeter out of the middle of it.
Exactly. And then it's ideal if that cardboard or cardstock or paper that you make this from corresponds with your palette. Because then you can have your palette, that is whatever color value it is, and then look at nature. You need to have 2 of them so that you block one in front of your painting and one in front of nature in a corresponding zone. And you can look at, from a 1-to-1 scale, how does that particular color and value in a particular area correspond? So what you do then is that you're taking that particular zone out of context, where you can actually see what the color and the value is in that particular area.
You're almost like creating a pixel. In a way, like you're just isolating this one little kind of square moment that you can see, and saying, absent of any context, or rather like in the context of the color and value of your visual isolation device, what is that little chip of value, that little mosaic tile of color value look like?
Exactly. And that's so helpful when you are color mixing, because that is a very thorough way just to decipher like what is the dominant color value in an area of the shadow or the light shape, mid-tone, background, wherever it may be. So that's a really nice guide to systematize your palette and to see well the color and the values that exist in nature, and to be able to translate it cohesively in the painting. And then you can, then you have fine-tuned your instrument into the task at hand, and you can flow more organically as you are painting as well.
So what do you do, like, so let's say we're visually isolating things and we're looking at, I'm thinking of like, I always think of working in the model room when I think of it as the place that I use it most. So I don't think of like still life necessarily or portraiture for some reason. But let's say you're visually isolating this area like on the model's foot or something, and really, the size of the foot you're seeing is kind of too small in a way for the visual isolation device. So it's like a gradient of value across the foot, and there's toes in it, and there's like a piece of the background. What if you can't does it work in all situations? Or is it like, are there places where you just have to kind of look and see?
Yeah. So your question is a little bit based on site size too, I imagine.
Okay, well, I guess, but anywhere where you're like far enough away from the model.
Yeah. Right. So yes, because if you're just looking at the color and the value in a particular area, you don't need to be standing in your point of observation. So let's say if you're using site size, you have to be standing away so that you're seeing everything kind of at the same scale, for example. But with this, you can just go forward. So if it's really far away, just step forward, because you're not looking at just the proportion, shadow shape, light shape, the proportions of those forms in relationship to each other. You're looking at particular, color values within a zone. So you can get really close to subject matter. If it is so that it is a small, like a hand, then you need to observe it better, for example. But I use it all the time in other genres as well, and definitely in still life and portraiture also.
One of in terms of like techniques about seeing color, like how you, because I do feel actually that it is a technique to seeing it. It's not really like something. I mean, there's a feeling to it, but for me, very much it's concept and technique based, right? So my favorite kind of way to look at the figure or look at a portrait even and kind of decipher what my color context is going to be in the flesh tones is to identify like the warmest and coolest area on the subject, right? So inevitably there will be like some turning plane that's like catching a bit of raking light, and it'll have this slightly kind of coolish kind of gray temperature depending upon the model's skin tone. But you usually be able to find something where it's a little bit less warm than another area. And then you find, like, you look at the model's lips or the rosiness of their cheeks or whatever it is, that is like really, really red-orange. And you have right there the two ends of your color value spectrum, right? So when you look at, let's say we find the extreme warm and we find the extreme cool, you can then look at like a relatively warm area, right? Look at the forehead or something. Compare it to the coolest area, compare it to the warmest area. You'll be able to almost figure out or theorize like an exact position on that spectrum of warm and cool where that color value should be. And that's usually how I'm kind of taking my hypotheses like into my flesh tone application. It's very much, it has to be like, you have to identify the context.
Yes, absolutely. So with the visual isolation technique, it's not about working in isolation ultimately. It's about looking at the different components that create the holistic element of nature. So ultimately it's about finding the relationships, but like looking at the parts that generate those relationships. So it's possible to, for example, use this visual isolation device for that endeavor exactly. So if you wonder like what is the coolest or dark or warmest or darker or lightest element in nature, you can compare, you can use your visual isolation device and look at nature as well.
Of course, to compare like the darkest dark, the lightest light or something and find. So you don't have to compare just to your artwork, you can compare also with the nature.
Oh yes, you can be innovative, So if you wonder like
anything, you have to be innovative with these ideas, right? It's like a tool, and you can use it for a lot of different stuff.
Absolutely. So if you wonder like what how much light is on the cheek compared to how dark the shadow is. You can make a comparison.
Or even between, when it gets more and more subtle, between like lighter and slightly lighter halftones,
Yeah.
Like you kind of, in one way, when you're learning to look at values, like anything that's kind of light just looks light, and like you have this like massively simplified vision of what values are.
Yeah. And I think often an issue when learning values completely is to recognize how light the light can be and also how dark the darks can be. Yeah. Often I find that the darkest darks are rendered too light.
Yeah.
And also it often happens that the values within the light are rendered too dark.
Yeah.
So again, using this visual isolation device can be a really wonderful guide when just learning about values. Even in the context of drawing, this is an awesome tool. But I think specifically for deciphering color and values as well.
Yeah. And the thing probably with all of these ideas we discussed, visual isolation, color and value, temperature, really anything that you're going to do with with the whole kind of like concept of color, each one like fills the other out. I would really suggest that you just experiment with and become proficient at all of these different ways of looking at it. Some of them you're going to find like suit your personality more, suit the way that you work more. I know that you really love the visual isolation device. For me, I think it's a great device. I just don't. This is not the thing for me that I use.
But this is also, we have a different...
But you should know what it is. You should know how to use it.
Yeah.
Right? The same thing with and this is what happens all the time. All right. Since this is an FAQ podcast, I feel it is my duty to say, this is the thing that is thought about pre-mixing your color values most often. This is just too hard. So you just don't want to do it. You gotta spend time pretty much being bad at color mixing with your palette knife until you get good at it, and then it becomes super useful.
Yeah.
The first time you mix your color values with a palette knife, it's probably not going to be a good thing. I mean, if it is, fantastic.
That's excellent. Good for you.
But probably you're going to wind up mixing it too cold or too hot or this or that. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't practice it.
Yeah.
It definitely means you should practice it more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great synopsis. Something else I want to add to that as well is just in terms of cool, warm, because this could be a whole nother discussion, by the way. I think we should save it for some other time as well. Like, what is it that makes a color or a shadow cool versus warm? Because it can greatly vary depending on the environment. But we should talk about that in depth another time. But let's say, very often what occurs if you're working with portraiture or the figure or even still lifes in an indoor environment, we tend to see that the shadows are often quite warm and the darkest transitional halftones are tending quite cool. And then within the light, there is a little bit more of a fluctuation between cool and warm. Often in the context of portraiture, there will be a little bit more red in the area of the cheeks and the ears and the nose and the lips. And then the chin and the forehead will often be a little bit cooler, but it can,
It could be a whole other topic as well, because what you're starting to talk about is like color themes, right? And color tendencies. Like just like if you're like, I imagine like a landscape painter, right? Like there are tendencies to the way that light passes over the earth that kind of create these repeatable contexts, right? When you're painting the figure and you're painting portraits for so long, you notice there are these tropes or these themes that run
tendencies.
Like a red thread through like most of the portraits that you paint or most of the color relationships that you're using, and that's another what's a whole other kind of bag to unpack, really.
Yes, for sure.
Because there are things you can expect to happen. They're not going to happen every time. Like you were mentioning the indoors. Most often you're going to get warm shadow, cool, very dark halftone, then warmer halftones following that, like dark halftones following that. Most often it's going to happen. If you do it, though, as a rule, you risk to become a little bit generic, because it actually doesn't happen all the time. Like if you have, for instance, like a very warm local color on the flesh, like on the like a very rosy cheek or something, as that transitions towards shadow, you're not going to get that really cool dark halftone, right? Because the local color of the skin is affecting it. Or on a lip or something, like lips that are really like red and rosy. You won't get that. But like on a more pale section of the skin, you definitely will. I don't know, I'm just over-explaining now.
But it also ties in with complexions, because you have complexions, let's say Italian skin, Italian complexion, very often have that sort of olive complexion, Mediterranean.
Yeah.
So a lot of gold undertones, a lot of warmth. And
they use
so
a lot of yellow ochre, isn't it? In Italy. Yeah.
A lot of umber.
Yeah.
But there is still a relationship of cool and warm even in a warm complexion.
Yeah.
But what I often find to be the case then is that the shadows will be even a bit more reddish, and then the dark halftone will still be cool, but it will be a bit more green, which is more of a cooler temperature than red, for example.
Yeah.
So you still have an expression of cool, but it will be, of course, a warmer mixture than if you were mixing color and values and temperatures for a sort of cold northern complexion that contains a lot of purple, where maybe the darkest transitional halftone, in its cool expression would be more purple rather than green, let's say.
Yeah, this one, these themes, I mean, they threw me for so long. I think just starting out figure painting, if I had possessed the premise that skin tones, more often than not, right, if we just play the numbers, more often than not, they're warm with a cool accent. Of course, as a student, though, you think warm, cool flesh tones. You start searching for these cool flesh tones, and if you're a lover of theory and things, you can force yourself to see more than there should be in a way. And I think I did that for a long time. Is I painted skin tones way too cold, just because I didn't start out from the standpoint that really more or less, right, most of the skin tones that you're going to find, they're just relatively warm.
Yeah.
On the spectrum of orange to blue,
they're
going to sit way more towards the
orange.
The red-orange side.
That's true.
Just in general.
Yeah.
To make it all the way over to that cool section is the exception to the rule, really. But you love to find that exception too. It's
definitely.
like magic when you see. I'm always impressed when I see a painter fit that teal green into a portrait and have it kind of sit in situ without even seeming out of place.
You're describing your own painting now.
No, I'm describing a very specific Sargent painting that I was just looking at today.
Okay.
It was this really wonderful green halftone, but because his context was so just ironclad, and all of his paintings are like that, you didn't really you didn't notice it as this strange aberrant green color. But if I just pointed at that color out of context and said that's on a skin tone, you'd go "Ugh, geez." But it's always it's this really exceptional, impressive thing to me. And I think that's what painters, I think it's one of the things where they kind of love going into painting flesh tones, is seeing how far people can play with those themes, can improvise on those themes.
Yeah, for sure. And that's also why there isn't one true palette.
Yeah.
This idea that it's, you have to search for the right palette, that it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
That's the philosopher's stone, in a way. Palette alchemy.
Harry Potter thing?
No.
What is the philosopher's stone?
No, it's what alchemist would use as a way to, as a recipe for gold.
Yeah. Don't think that I just know Harry Potter.
Yeah, so, but basically, it's so fascinating to be working with just different color combinations, precisely because there's just so many options out there.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like maybe recipes as well, there's certain combination of colors that do really unique things. For example, I recently painted Varvara, and I really fell in love with the combination of ultramarine, violet, and raw umber, because I felt that particular combination really vocalized the sort of complementary color dynamic in certain areas of her complexion, because in that particular combination, the raw umber was essentially an earth yellow, whereas the ultramarine violet, of course, is a violet, and yellow and violet are complementary. So there's a complementary relationship there that was making that color combination very dynamic, but they were also fairly soft, not like really bright yellow, it's an earth yellow. So there's a natural just harmony and balance there as well.
And that's just like one pairing.
One pairing.
Out of like innumerable pairings. I mean, that's the thing. You could have like a vastly expanded palette, or a palette that consisted of 3 actual colors and 2 non-colors even, and still each one can kind of create a vibrant set of fresh tones. And each one can create a vibrant set of flesh tones.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And then there can be like certain like color themes. Like I find that I'll have the basics, which is black, white, ochre. I will play around with the red. Usually I will just change the red around. And sometimes I will add a cool yellow, or I will work around it, so I will have a certain theme. But like to bring in, to eliminate ultramarine and ultramarine blue, and to eliminate cobalt blue, and replace it with a ultramarine violet, and then have this raw umber in the situation. I just thought that did something really unique that made me very excited.
Or even like from a practical standpoint as well, like you can take choices. One of the questions I get all the time is like, why vermilion and alizarin crimson? And I actually remember even as a student, this is like total mystery to me, like why you would choose, which seems like in my mind now like almost ridiculous, but like why have a vermilion, which is like a light kind of orangish red.
Like a coral almost.
Yeah, and then alizarin crimson, which is this deep transparent red, like that's almost like a black in a way. Why have them both? It's perfectly clear, of course, if you need to warm up a very dark area, you can't choose a pure pigment with a very high key local value, right? Like if you took a black and white photograph of a swatch of vermilion versus alizarin crimson, on a gray scale, the alizarin crimson would be quite dark, the vermilion would be quite light. So think about trying to make a deep, dark, rich, warm shadow, and putting vermilion into it is going to increase the value. So that's why you need 2 reds. You couldn't just do it with vermilion. Or you would be compromised in some sense of the color you'd be able to express without it. So it'd be the same thing choosing a blue, or in fact the yellow that I use is exactly because it's a transparent color that I can use in the shadows. Or the lights. But I don't want to get too far into the weeds.
We have gone too far already.
We went way far into the weeds. Just to wrap up though, some of the concepts you want to think about, learning about color. Certainly, learning to mix colors with your palette knife is a really big skill that will apply to your practice, even if you go on to just be a brush mixing painter. Choosing the palette that you need in order to get the colors and values that you are looking for, super important. Visual isolation device, incredibly important. And also starting to understand the concept of a color spectrum between warm and cool. This is the way that you're really going to express flesh tones in oil painting. Once again, I'm Stephen Bauman.
I'm Cornelia Hernes. Thank you so much for joining us for this little chat. We have so much more that we want to share with you and talk about, so we hope to see you again.
You can find in the description for this video the links to our Patreon pages if you're interested in more tutorial content. Also, please take the time to subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's going to help us grow, and feel free to also share it on social media. Thank you so much for tuning in.